everyone. This is John Daly. I'm here with another episode of the Daly Express. Today, I have on a very special guest, someone I'm honored to call a friend. She's a victim's advocate, a public speaker, a popular podcaster. She co hosts the Survivor's Guide to True Crime, and she's absolutely huge on TikTok. I'm talking about Kimberly Corban. Kimberly, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Say huge. I don't think that word means what you think that it means.
I think you're pretty big. I think you're pretty big. I've seen you pop up on my social media feeds for reasons unrelated to us being friends. So it's just kind of organic. So it's pretty impressive.
I'm still cringe to my children though. So yeah, that's the real meter of success. They cringe. So I'm not that big.
And I'm doing a great job with my family if that's the case. Yes. Well, thanks for joining me. It's great to have you on. I know you're a very busy person, so I appreciate you making time for me on my humble little podcast here.
I
Like I
love it.
said,
Of
you
course.
yes. Well, I was gonna say I thought you were super busy until you showed me those headphones a second ago. Maybe you could show people those
Okay.
ones you hand designed yourself.
I feel like I have to clarify that I have to have a wind down activity that is sometimes it's puzzle or like coloring, whatever it might be. Anyway, for a couple of weeks, this was it. For those of you who can see,
That's
there's
fantastic.
I want to say there's over 10,000 or so, something. They're the teeny tiny construction glue that like you pick up with the tip of an eraser and place individually. And I ended up inhaling a lot more glue than I had anticipated. So there's a couple
Well,
of
for
weeks
those of
where
you
I don't remember my name.
those of you who can't see it, it's sort of a what would you call it, like a bedazzled earphones, or it's not bedazzled, but they got
Yes,
shiny little.
yeah, it's like a bedazzler, but you put them on with teeny tiny little drops of like construction adhesive glue.
Well,
I,
it
I
looks
have
great.
hobbies, I promise.
Well, like I said, Kimberly, you are a victim's advocate, and it's a role that is very personal to you, and it's really become your life mission, helping others who have gone through a terrible traumatic experience. Would you mind sharing your own story that ultimately put you on this path?
Sure. So I actually grew up in Greeley, Colorado. It's about an hour north of Denver. I went to UNC, which I always say UNC, and then I have to clarify for anyone outside of Colorado that that means UNCO, so the University of Northern Colorado, for undergrad. And while I was there, I had a stranger break into my college apartment, hold me hostage for 2 hours, and sexually assault me. I knew right away that I was going to report if I were able to survive that attack. The case was then investigated by the Greeley Police Department. When they finally caught the suspect, it was about 3 weeks later. It went over to the Weld County District Attorney's Office, which put my life obviously on a completely different path than I had ever anticipated. So we ended up going through the entire judicial process. It was about 16 months from the time of the assault until inevitably sentencing, which concluded after a 5-day jury trial where he was found guilty of sexual assault and of burglary. And leading up to this, I experienced a lot of mental health issues. I was struggling greatly in school. I was having a lot of issues that um, I didn't think were attributed to the assault at the time, but now with hindsight, I can say absolutely they were. And through all of that, I had looked at this entire experience thinking, why did this have to happen to me? And not in a way that was like searching for pity, but in I have to make something out of this. I have to do something with it. And so I decided to release my name to the media. I worked with a great journalist back then who did all of the things that I now teach others today to do. And she made sure that, she had consent, that she got the facts right, that she took time to follow up with me. And when we got that conviction, she came up and she said, "Okay, Kim, are you sure you want to do this?" I said, "Absolutely." It was not commonplace and still really isn't, but by far and away not commonplace back in 2007 for the victim of a sexually based crime to be named. And I went ahead and did that. It published in our local paper, and I didn't know till many years later, but there was a 78-year-old woman in my same jurisdiction who had a case very similar going through the system at the time. And she said, she had been an uncooperative witness. She didn't want to report. She didn't want to talk about it. She just wanted it to go away. She called her victim advocate on Monday morning after these 2 articles had run in the Greeley Tribune and said, I read the paper this weekend. If Kim can do it, so can I. And she got up on the stand later that fall and put a serial rapist away for the rest of his life. So I didn't know it then, but that was at least one person that I was able to help. The first time I ever, quote unquote, spoke was actually to a group of peer advocates at UNC. I sat around a conference table and there were maybe 10 of them or so. And I just told them what happened. I talked to them about the previous year of my life and I let them ask questions. And I knew that if they asked me something that I wasn't completely comfortable answering, that it was something I needed to work on in therapy, because none of these things that happened to me or the ways that my mind and body chose to cope should have been labeled as my fault. And yet we live in a culture and a society that attributes and, assigns that blame to the victim instead of the perpetrator, because it's easier. It's easier to put that on a person who didn't have a choice in it, because you want to think that, well, if I had my way, I wouldn't be wearing that. I wouldn't have drank that much. I wouldn't have gone to that party. I wouldn't have gone on that date. I'd have known better. In our minds, we think that we can separate ourselves from the likelihood that a crime like this can occur. And in reality, that's not the case at all. So it is safer in our minds to assign that blame to a victim as opposed to the offender. I constantly talk on campuses and to different organizations and government entities. And the biggest thing that we have seen in research over the last almost 20 years since my assault is that the number of victims is actually far greater than we ever anticipated. More people are being educated about what gender-based violence, what sexual violence really is, and understanding that, oh my gosh, okay, that thing that I just didn't feel was right, that I had blamed myself for, actually is a crime. And whether or not they choose to report it does not negate what happened to them, and it definitely doesn't negate the trauma that they experienced after the fact. So I decided to switch majors halfway through my junior year, positive life choice. And I switched from business marketing to criminal justice and psychology, and then went on for grad school, swapped those two. So it was criminal justice, and I had an emphasis in psychology. Ended up graduating. I worked for the Greeley Police Department as an on-call victim advocate for a few years before I started at the DA's office. I created and ran the adult diversion program, was there for about 5 years before I left and was working remote for a company based out of DC. And I have always done speaking events and keynotes. And it wasn't until about 2016 that I decided, okay, I really need to make this like what I devote the large amount of my time to. And so everything since then has been a constant pursuit of that career goal, but I do a lot of consulting now, speaking, and then have an online presence.
Absolutely. And you have, I mean, you really are an inspiration, Kimberly. You have helped so many people. You have taken this event in your life and really made something very positive out of it. You're talking about, public speaking. You've been all over the country. I think maybe probably outside the country, speaking about your experience and you're advocating for victims. You've been on major news networks. You've spoken at universities. You did a TED Talk, which was great. You were even at a CNN presidential town hall years ago, where you were asking then President Obama about specific legislation. So I'm wondering, how hard is it for you to talk about such a serious and personal topic in front of these huge audiences? I assume you've become more comfortable with it over time, but it still has to be. I would think it would still have to be hard, but maybe not.
Very much so. So it has changed over the course of, it's been 18 years. This assault happened in 2006. And I've had the story, if you will, in my mind for so long that I was able to work through that with extensive therapy for many, many years. And I got into a type of therapy that at the time was fairly new called EMDR. So it's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And that seemed to be the golden ticket for me. That was a way for me to process without necessarily having to put all of my feelings and trauma, for lack of a better term, into words. I could process through those internally and then get to a point where I wasn't being derailed because I suffered from everything like PTSD, depression, panic attacks, and then those progressed into what are called psychogenic non-epileptic seizures related to PTSD. So they are seizures that I was having between 3 and 10 times a day. They'd last anywhere from 3 minutes to 3 hours. For a little while there, couldn't figure out exactly what the cause was. They're trying to medicate it, but it really is completely due to that overwhelming stress and trauma on the brain, where my brain, it has a tendency to either completely dissociate or I divert and use a sense of humor, which that's just in general all the time for me anyway. Or it has this, where it can't over stress or over panic and it shuts off completely. And those manifested looking like seizures. So I had all of these things that I'm dealing with, but at the same time, I knew what was happening to me as it was happening. This was a very black and white crime. And I also know that I am statistically insignificant. Like, this is a very, very small percentage of the population that are attacked by complete strangers. Typically, what we see is that it is somebody who is an acquaintance. Maybe it's a friend on the fringe or an intimate partner. Those are most likely to happen, is the intimate partner, whether that is during the relationship or immediately thereafter. And what you see is not just one event, but many events that then culminate in a type of complex PTSD. So you have all of these things that are being pushed together. And I don't find it as hard to speak about my one event that I knew was rape while it was happening and that I had a successful conclusion. Now, that is not saying that I did not suffer trauma, that I didn't go through just absolute hell and back, but I've had that free of guilt kind of mindset since the beginning. Most people do not. And there are other things that I have experienced in my life that I are in direct contrast to that, where I do have those and I know that I shouldn't. And even as a victim advocate, I'm like, I know better. And yet I still can't overcome those feelings. And that's for most people, most victims, what they experience. So I think the parts that make me nervous is like, for the first time ever during a speech, it happened to be my TED Talk. I got cotton mouth. That never happens to me. And I'm like getting my upper lip stuck on my teeth. So there's a few parts where I'm like, oh, that's super. No one could tell, but I sure could. Those are the things that I get nervous about. One time I was giving a speech and went to walk up the stage and I walked directly out of my high heel. Also embarrassing, but like those are the things that I think I get nervous about. And then I get up there and for my keynotes, I actually play my 911 call first because I want to set the stage for every single person there that the story that they are about to hear, the information they're going to hear, it is not the same person that they hear screaming on that 911 call. I'm a vastly different person, but to keep that girl in mind because that's who we're dealing with. So I kind of get that level playing field to start with, right? And then I feel like I just sort of sink into the groove. I have my same things like during my actual keynote that I'll go to, and I don't want to call them one-liners necessarily, but I have that cadence of events down. When there are things externally that I may be working into the presentation, I have found that it is something that I need to sandbox or work through with my therapist, with my husband, with my close friends first, because in the advocacy realm, I have realized that there's a lot of people who are wounded themselves that come to this line of work because they want to help who they were beforehand. And the only way that you can do that work well is if you make sure that you are speaking and educating and empowering from a scar, not an open wound. And so if you have those things that are actively happening, you can't help anybody until you help yourself. You hear about apply your own air mask before you apply to children. It's kind of the same thing. You have to take care of yourself before you take care of others.
So, Kimberly, one thing that really bothers me about our culture, and you touched on this a little bit already, but when it comes to accusations of sexual assault or other forms of sexual abuse, there tends to be people who are inclined to dismiss such accusations or scoff at them if they aren't made immediately after the incident. I think that's especially the case when the accused individual is a public figure, someone that people know. We've seen lots of examples of women waiting a while, in some cases, before coming forward and reporting what happened to authorities. Kimberly, how do you respond to people who do take that immediate view of dismissing, or in some cases, even attacking the accuser if the accuser didn't come forward right away? What are those people missing?
Sadly, we see this in the world of advocacy all the time. And for the same reason, sometimes as what I already mentioned, is you don't want to think that you could ever find yourself in this situation, right? You want to think that you would have done it this way, you would have reported right away, you would have gone to the police, and you just don't know until you are in that scenario, especially when you have an element of power or the imbalance of power. That's really, really scary to come up against. So not only are you worried about going forward and reporting, you know, possibly having a sexual assault exam at the hospital, but then having to go up against those systems that are already stacked against you. There are so many reasons that women, men, survivors, victims don't report, that we oftentimes forget that when we call those out and we scream and bang on our keyboards, you're contributing to that reason right there. And I think that it's not so much that they're missing something, but that they don't want to examine the alternative. And we know so much more about trauma and how it impacts the brain now. There's been so much research done about how this activates parts of our brains when we are experiencing a traumatic event like this. Over half of all victims of sexual assault believe at some point that they will be killed throughout the course of that assault. That is something that is mind altering. When we talk about PTSD in veterans, a lot of times it is those weird things that'll stick in their mind where they're like, hey, it's not seeing my buddy go into combat and not come back out. It's this smell that's associated with what was in the barracks. And like sometimes those things don't make sense. Well, the same can be said of those that are experiencing trauma here in our own communities. So there's a myriad of reasons that we don't want to come forward. And maybe, God forbid, it's that we don't remember. There are so many cases where you have victims who are incapacitated, be it by drugs, alcohol. When I was talking about, jokingly, I dissociate, that's actually a really common response. We hear often of fight or flight. There's also the freeze response, which is called tonic immobility. It is how the brain literally protects itself during that trauma. And then there's another response, a fourth one that is really hitting the research. Some people have referred to this as fawn, but the latest studies are starting to call it appease. So your fourth response is appease. And this is actually what I did with my attacker. So at first, my body, my mind froze during the course of my assault. And then as I'm watching the sunrise and trying to gather evidence and things, I didn't have a sense of sight. And I knew that I could not escape. I couldn't fight back. I couldn't kick and scream and do all the things that I always thought that I would do. But I could use my wits to keep myself alive. And so when he completed his assault, I started talking to him and I led him to believe that I was to blame, that I felt shame, that I didn't want my parents or my boyfriend or my friends to know that this had happened, and that I wasn't going to tell because this was just so embarrassing. And led him to believe, I appeased him. I almost was over the top in making him feel as though he was in the right. And that appeasement is ultimately what saved my life. And so many people do that. When you look at domestic violence or cases where, let's say that it's a boss or somebody that's in a position of power, coaches, teachers, those things that you hear about often in headlines, but don't want to believe actually happen. When you have that imbalance of power, especially, you have victims who are taught to appease that person, to keep themselves alive, to keep, maybe it's their job, maybe it's a sense of safety, maybe it's a home. All of these things are constantly wrapped up in these victim responses. And sometimes it's not safe to come forward. Sometimes it's not safe for years to come forward because there are threats of violence. There are times where the perpetrator doesn't have to say in so many words that there will be consequences. They groom their victims so that they know there will be consequences. Those are the things that they're looking at. You don't have to say them out loud. And that's really hard to quantify in court. And it's especially hard to convince someone if they have not been in that position before. But what I always like to say is that an abnormal response to an abnormal situation is normal. So when the Me Too movement came about, and I suddenly am sitting there on my couch and I'm seeing all these tweets come in of person after user after story saying nothing but Me Too. I got asked immediately, aren't you mad about this? Aren't you mad that people are taking away or detracting from what happened to you? Aren't you mad that these are people that didn't experience really a real rape? And I sat there flabbergasted because as I'm going through this and listening to these stories, I'm realizing I've been in so many of these places. I'm going to use the term men, even though we know that offenders can be any background demographic, but predominantly it is men who are committing these crimes. A man doesn't wake up one day and just choose to go rape someone. It is a series of small transgressions that eventually lead up to that assault. We're talking about just a mindset, misogyny. That seems like a dirty word to so many people where they're like, oh, that's, third, fourth, fifth wave feminism, and I must have blue hair if I'm spouting that kind of crap. I hear that all the time. When actually, misogyny isn't necessarily about the man. It's about the whole system that is propping up that thought process. And it's teaching you, don't challenge that. This is just the way that it's supposed to be. And that's reinforced by so many other activities, beliefs, lifestyles that you're just taught to not ever think secondly about it. And that isn't always your fault, but it is your fault if you're not trying to educate yourself further when it's brought to your attention. So you have these mindsets, and then you have actions, and maybe it's just verbal at first where it's harassment. I love this one. Well, how are we even supposed to compliment, and what are we even supposed to say anymore? I can't even talk to women in the workplace. If that's how you took what came out of Me Too, then you're probably right. You really shouldn't, and you may want to see somebody about that. But there's like these stepping stones, right? You get to harassment, and then it's, hey, I'm taking things just a little too far with an eventual, maybe it's a consenting partner for a few things and not more than that. And they keep pushing that envelope until eventually they work up to an assault. Just like everyone knows a victim in their life, everyone also knows an offender. And that's an icky feeling to sit with. But we all know somebody who has offended, and it's up to us to be that person. If you see some of those stair stepper kind of traits, to intervene, to be okay with feeling uncomfortable and saying, you know what? Don't love that. So when I was being approached and saying, oh, don't you hate this? Doesn't it detract? No, it gives more visibility and more voice to those actions that hopefully will stop someone from eventually progressing to the point where I found myself with a stranger who had taken it upon himself to stalk me for a week, figure out a time to break in, hold me captive in my room, and sexually assault me with a threat of coming back and going to a neighboring apartment complex to pick out his next victim that same morning.
That is such an important perspective to hear. I think people really need to understand what you're describing, because I think there is, it's just there's not, with a lot of people, there's not that inherent understanding of, you have to have been there to really truly, um, I think, explain that in a way that helps people that just can't identify with that.
Yeah. And I look at the entire problem of whether you want to call it gender-based violence or sexually based violence. This isn't a problem with feminism. This is an attack on masculinity, if you want to call it that. Because what it is doing is taking the very worst of a gender, of a population, and saying we now can't trust anyone because we don't know who or how to trust. And the best way that we can combat that is for fellow men to stand up to each other and say, these are the hard stops. These are boundaries. You've got to teach each other because they're not going to listen to us. Those systems are set up in a way that, it downgrades a woman's voice. It downgrades a victim. And I feel like every time there's any mention of gender, automatically you have people who are snapping to a judgment. And my whole goal is to get you to stop from snapping there. I look at this when there was a lot of conversations that happened that are big gut checks for me along the course of my career. And I always have this in my mind where my initial reaction, that snap reaction, that's what you've been conditioned. Whatever your second thought is, that's what you've taught yourself. That's what you're learning. So, you see memes that you're like, oh my God, oh my gosh, you can't say that out loud. That initial thought is what you've been conditioned. And then what are you going to do with that secondarily? Are you going to keep passing it on, or are you going to intervene and say, you know what? It's going to stop here. And it's those little things. I'm talking about something very small like a meme. Then it works its way up to those large crimes that leave victims and communities in shambles, because whether you see it or not, it is happening.
That's such an important thing to know. So, as I said earlier, you are, Kimberly, a force of nature on social media, even though you were a little humble. But
Something.
on TikTok, I think your posts have gotten something like 7 million likes in total. I remember back when you first started to build this social media presence, that you were doing almost entirely funny stuff, little
Yeah.
skits, responding to the latest social media trends. You're obviously a very funny and engaging person. But I wasn't quite sure. I'm an older guy. I don't know if you're a millennial or not, but I
I
was
am
sort
an
of
elder millennial. I had the Facebook, as we are supposed to tell you as an elder millennial card carrying member.
well, as an older dude, I wasn't quite sure what it was you were doing at the time, or what the goal was.
It
And I
was
think I
hard.
got to ask you. Yeah, but I was like, was it just to entertain people? Because it was entertaining. But no, I think I asked you about it, and you told me, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here. This was years ago, but that
Yeah.
this was about building this, organic audience and a platform for which you would ultimately start talking about these much more serious issues that are in your wheelhouse. And you were basically showing people who you were before getting into the issues, these serious issues that matter, and the things that have shaped your life. And to be clear, for those who want to follow Kimberly on social media, she still does a lot of funny stuff, a lot of entertaining stuff, in addition to advocating for victims. But I'm curious if this, happy warrior approach that I would phrase it
I like
as,
that. I like that.
yeah, good. I'm wondering, do you think it really connects with people in a way that the important messages you're spreading otherwise might not connect with people?
Yes. And to be clear, at the beginning, I wasn't trying to entertain anybody but myself. I had,
It worked.
so
It got me. It took me in.
I've always had a social media presence, and for a long time, like the other folks of my generation, it was strictly just to do like personal stuff, friend to friend. And as those algorithms developed, as those platforms broadened, I found myself at this weird position where like I'm still connecting with friends and family, but everybody knows that I do this. And so I'd post things about like, hey, I went and spoke here and it's really cool. But I didn't treat it like a business necessarily. And then when the pandemic came about, I had been on TikTok for 6 months or so because my kids, my older two, were of the age where they're starting to want to do this. And, me being the family IT department, need to know how all of the parental settings work. And so I'm on there, well, TikToking feeds me the For You page that it knows I want to see. And so it's a lot of funny mom content and, animal videos and that kind of highbrow humor that I found. I was like, oh, I love doing this. This is like perfect for me because those short, sweet little brain bites that I could easily film pretty quickly. It fit with my personality how I already was. I didn't feel like I was changing anything. I was just recording some silly videos. And then I hit, I think it was 10,000 followers or so. And I realized that this is also in the time of the pandemic, that this is where the most vulnerable demographic is. I can't go out to college campuses or to schools and speak to them in person right now. We're all locked down, but assaults are still occurring. Domestic violence still happening. All of these crimes didn't just stop because the world stopped for a few months. So I met them where they were. And I started making this content that, hey, you can have a sense of humor about it. let's be clear, rape jokes aren't funny. But jokes about your own trauma and how you deal with them can be. And so I wanted to show that it's okay to make these jokes, to have this dark sense of humor, and also not let it be the only thing that you're doing. You also have to work on it. So I started to show a little bit more of like what a quote unquote victim looks like. Like, this is the way I live my life, and I don't have to be shameful about any of that. And also, I've dedicated my life and career to that education piece, and I would love to share some of the things that I have learned interspersed with really bad dance videos and lip syncing. So, it just fit my personality really well, and that carried over then, of course, across platforms. And so I love still the marketing advertising side of all things. And I feel that that's a component that has been missing for a long time in the advocacy space. So to get on there and find just a few other survivors who had that same sense of humor and way that they were talking and educating was really refreshing, because I don't meet those people in real life. The ones that I've been closest with are on the opposite side of the country, but it's worked because that way we're connected in a space that other people are going to be able to learn from us too. And we can have differing experiences, but you're creating that organic community, as you say, that's supportive and wants to learn. You don't have to know everything. You don't have to say it right correctly every single time. I mean, we talk about cancel culture and how damning that is, especially for our younger kids, because my whole thing, especially now that, my friend Kara and I host a podcast called Survivor's Guide to True Crime. It's okay if you didn't know better before. That's okay. We're never going to shame you for that. We're glad you're here because you want to learn to be better. And that's what the whole thing is about. So if you are screaming at somebody, they're automatically going to shut off. I find that humor is a great way to bring people together. It's kind of disarming and allows you to have that common ground to really learn from each other.
I was going to ask you next about your podcast, actually. You said a survivor's guide to true crime. There's obviously a lot of public interest out there in the topic, of true
Oh,
crime.
yeah. Yep.
Yeah, for sure. It's huge on TV. Can you tell people what the podcast is about?
Sure. So we were actually recording this earlier. My friend Kara is living in South Carolina with her family there, and we give each other permission to talk about this all the time. But Kara has a great sense of humor, and also, by the way, survived a serial killer abducting her and holding her hostage, and she escaped and led the police to him, and it solved a bunch of outstanding cold cases. So she's fabulous. You can follow her. All of her links and things are on our show page and mine to learn more about her story, which is really great. But we had connected because we had the same kind of sense of humor. And what started is like we were trying to host lives together on TikTok during the lockdown and didn't know that you couldn't do that. So it was like a learning experience. And thankfully, under the tutelage of a really great friend of ours who is well versed in the podcast world, that's how we landed on hosting a podcast. We wanted to create a space that we felt with each other, that when you meet another survivor, there's an authenticity there where you just know, and you don't have to describe and explain all of these background things. It's like, let's dive into the darkest trauma and also make some fun jokes about it too. Like, this will be great. And you don't have to do that. Like, I'm worried about how you're going to take this. That's not there. And so the whole first season was us bringing a lot of our friends on that we've made in the advocacy community. So, we each started with sharing our own stories, which we did in detail. That's not something that we typically have our guests do. But we had like Elizabeth Smart on and Amanda Knox and JC Dugard and like just people that we know and love through doing this work for so many years. And what we focused on was not the crime itself. What somebody else did to you is the least interesting part about you. It's what happens between your ears afterwards. What do you make of it? What did you go on to become? And so we felt like we had to capture that true crime interest, that demographic, but we're not really a true crime show. We were just talking about this today, though. Like, what bucket do we fit in? Because, yeah, we're talking to crime victims, but it's not about like necessarily that specific crime. Now, they get to tell us about it in whatever way they're comfortable with, but it's a very small part of the show, and learning about all the things that they do afterwards. Where's that inspiration? What were the hurdles? What were the pitfalls? Because they're not all pretty flowers and cases that worked out like mine did. So getting to know them and have those really authentic, sometimes funny conversations is just really rewarding for both of us. We are now in our second season. This Wednesday, actually, our 40th episode will post. So it's just us doing it. I think that's important to point out. We have not sold to some larger company because at the base of everything that we do, consent has always been at the top. When you are creating true crime, because it is a very saturated market, who's benefiting from that? I like to talk about it as, are you watching something for a purpose? Are you taking action? Are you signing a petition? Are you changing laws? What are you doing with that? Or are you just consuming trauma porn? And Kara and I have both found ourselves in this scenario where people want to know our stories and they'll get it from, third parties who we've never met. One of the really jarring ones for me was seeing, I was going through my For You page, and somebody had a video up of like themselves playing Roblox, the kids video game. And over that video is my 911 call of me screaming. And it's got the captions. And I'm like, oh my God. Well, my 12-year-old at the time popped up on his For You page too. That's not a platform that I want that on. And then trying to go back and say, hey, can you please take that down? They don't care. They're profiting. They are monetizing that trauma and profiting off of it. And there is just this general sense of yuck, right? So Kara and I wanted to create a space where not only do we have the consent of the survivor, but they maintain total autonomy that entire time. I've had really great interactions and really, really bad ones with different media outlets, with organizations who will say one thing and then they have all this content and you pouring your heart and soul out into either a camera or a piece of writing. And oh, by the way, we're going to change this. We're going to edit it and then we're going to make it fit what we want. And that's out of our control suddenly. We didn't want survivors feeling that way. They have absolute say over everything that is included in that podcast. It's ethically created in that they get to choose what they do with that. They get to be proud of it. And at any point, if they ever decide they want it taken down, we do it. No questions asked, because we're not here to benefit off of them. It's not a money-making venture, I will say that much. We have a Patreon, which is great, and that's literally how we keep the lights on. And I love that, like, the really great community that we've built there knows that's how we fund like keeping a website alive. That's how, if we have to pay for a new microphone or something, that's it. We also, when we are able to turn a profit, are going to be paying those survivors for their time, for their expertise, because really, it's not for 30 minutes. It's not for an hour of storytelling or for them talking. We're paying them for their experience. And that is years and years of expertise and education and really looking at other people and just doing their best to educate themselves. That's what we want to highlight and showcase. So it's a very collaborative effort every single time. This second season, we have started, Kara and I will do our, is this a cussing podcast? Because ours is.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, we will have our dipshit chat hour where we talk about stupid things. And then also like some of the more current events for like two idiots with a microphone, but also we'll hit you with some like recent peer-reviewed journals and like, it's a big mix. It's all over the place. And then the other episodes we intersperse with survivor stories and experts. So we're having a nice mixture of those this season. And it's actually been really rewarding because we go to every recording and conversation, not having done research on these cases ourselves. If we're going to hear that, we want to hear it directly from that survivor. And that has been really helpful, I think, for us, because if you were just to meet somebody on the street, hopefully you wouldn't have Googled them or consumed a bunch of shows about them ahead of time. Tell me about you. Tell me about what's important to you, and let me get to know you as a person, not you as a crime victim. So that's kind of where Survivor's Guide to True Crime came from. But we've spent a lot of time on the name itself, which seems silly, but like we're talking months, because during that we were also honing, what do we want this to be about? Like, what's our mission here? And what we came down to was that we are trying to create an ethical space where it sets the standard for how crime victims and their families are treated, not just in the media, but in general. And if you are not providing them a seat at the table and the microphone to talk about their experience themselves, what are you doing and why are you doing it? And those kinds of things need to be conscious consumers questioning that. So we wanted to set that precedent, and we thought about it in a way that we've been through all this crap and we have all of these different chapters of information. What great like thoughts it would be if we had this guidebook with all of your notes in the margins and your highlighters and your post-its sticking out, and you were able to take that guidebook and hand it to another person who had just experienced a crime and be like, here, this is the roadmap I used. I know you're going to chart your own course, but in these pages is everything I've learned, and you get to continue and make your own notes and build off of that, and then you can share it with the next person. And we have just circled back to that every single time. If we ever forget why we're doing it, or we're stuck in editing mode or having tech issues, that's why, because we want it to help at least one person. And I'm very, very honored to say that it has.
Well, people should definitely check out the podcast. I'm going to link to it in the show notes along with all your
Awesome.
social media accounts as well. Um, just wanted to, and I know you've been very generous with your time. We this is actually episode went a little bit longer than people are going to realize because I had an internet malfunction. But I just wanted to say I first met you many years ago before you were an internet sensation.
When
we
you
did
were an
some.
internet, you were a sneaky internet sensation.
Oh yeah. Well, you know
Oh,
what? I would okay. I've talked about. I'm sort of out of the closet on this and have been for years. I was the Mark Uterus account on Twitter. I realize people aren't going to know much about that. I will link to. I wrote up a piece on that. My experiences that I'll put in the show
Colorado
notes.
lore now, I feel like.
That's right. That's right. But a while back we did. We'll call it community volunteer work together, and
Yeah.
there- we'll go with that. There's also that's also during that volunteer stuff is where I met the guy who would later become your husband. You are married to Michael Rourke, the Weld County
I am.
DA. He worked on your own case many years ago, and he and his amazing team have put away a lot of bad guys. I mean, they are on Dateline NBC all the time, you know.
I
And
know. They should have a punch card by this point.
oh yeah, yeah. And I actually like to text Michael from time to time just to say good job when there's a case that he before he puts someone away.
Yes.
Usually responds back with something like, "How did you get this number?" But
Bullshit. We get your Christmas cards.
oh,
That's,
that's
by the
yeah.
way, everyone, that is the Christmas card that I look forward to the most every single year, because it's like, you should be like a writer or something. Pick that
Yeah, I
up.
know. I should look
Weird.
into that, sort of explore that talent a little bit. But no, I'm just wanted to make the point. I view the two of you as hometown heroes. The
Oh,
amount of
thanks.
good, important work that you're both doing is really unbelievable. And I know a lot of people appreciate it, and I certainly appreciate you coming on today to talk about these topics. I think they're so important, and I have a huge amount of respect for you and the courage that you've shown throughout this journey. Before I let you go, I was, is there anything you'd like to else you'd like to say to Daily Express listeners? Are there any projects? We talked about, the podcast and the social media. Anything else you'd like to talk about?
Yes. So, what we do, we always leave our listeners with a call to action at the end. And so I try to, when I share my story, do the same. I want to leave you with a call to action. So if you are listening to this and getting pissed, inspired, whatever that emotion may be, I want you to take that and use it. So maybe for those of you who are looking for a way to impact survivors like me, it can be getting involved in a local level. So start by volunteering local. Those resources always need help with volunteers, whether it's um, advocacy hotline answering. They'll put you through that victim advocacy certification and the ability to learn those things. Folding pamphlets, like there is everything on a very wide spectrum that they need volunteer help for. That's one easy way to get involved. Another is if you can contact your legislators, get involved. That does not have to be as scary as it's made out to be. We include a lot of calls to action on the podcast, actually, when we have legislation that's being presented that may be detrimental to survivors. Those are typically nonpartisan, and it's a great way to use your voice and kind of test your waters with your representatives to see where they stand on some of these issues. VOCA funds, that's another one that I could go on a whole tangent about, but victim services funding is being cut in a major way, and it's flying under the radar unless you are a part of the advocacy community. Even survivors who are in the thick of their trauma don't know that this is something that they will lose, they will miss when it is not there, because those services are provided in such a way that makes them feel as though they don't have to worry about those things. So VOCA funding and the In Violence Against Women Act are very, very important. Please don't get caught up in the political ideologies of either side of this. I promise you that victimization of this magnitude does not care who you voted for. It can happen to anyone. And I used to be the epitome of the person that thought it would never happen to me until it did. And then the last call to action is for those of you who are maybe local to Northern Colorado. I just had the honor of being brought on as a consultant for development with our Sex Assault Resource Center here in Northern Colorado. So I am helping them, especially right now as we lead up to the Sava Soiree. It is their annual fundraiser. We are looking for any kind of donations, whether it's items for live auction, silent auction, mystery bags, or if you can just sponsor. If you can donate even $5, that goes a long way in helping with our prevention education programs and for therapy for victims and their families, and that presence here in Northern Colorado that serves survivor families just like mine.
Excellent, excellent. And I would like to donate a Sean Coleman thriller series to you, if you think that
Yes,
would be helpful.
you have to sign it. Absolutely. And we can throw it on the auction. You got to have a nice 8x10 glossy. We'll be sure to
Oh
include
yes,
that too.
yes. I have very old ones where I don't look at all like I do now that I can I can sign and get
Oh,
that.
my headshot's like over 10 years old now. I should probably update it. Probably.
Yes. Well, thanks, Kimberly. I had a lot of fun talking to you. A lot of great information, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks. You too. This has been a lot of fun.